In our last lesson, I commented briefly on the hospital that was at Valley Forge. I now want to go into more detail about this hospital and also about health and medicine in general. The hospital was called Washington Hall, and it was constructed in January of 1778, when things were at their worst at Valley Forge. Disease was spiraling out of control, and the rate of infection and death was becoming alarming. The hospital was built at Yellow Springs, about 10 miles away from Valley Forge. It had a naturally heated spring. It is the U.S. Army's first permanent military medical facility by order of Congress. It was a 3-story structure. The first floor was devoted to the kitchen, dining, utility, and storage rooms. The second floor had 2 large wards, and the third floor had more private rooms. Both the second and the third floor had 2 large exterior porches that would allow people in the hospital to get some fresh air. 1,300 soldiers were treated at this hospital from January to May in 1778. Now, in addition to that permanent hospital, each brigade also had temporary hospital buildings, and these were called flying hospitals. And these were filled first, and with the most sick moved off-site in quarantine to Washington Hall. Those flying hospitals actually contained the most sick men. Now, we know from the roll of men at Valley Forge that in January there were about 1,500 men who were sick. By February, that number had doubled to 3,000. In April and May, the number was at 3,800 sick men. And when Washington broke camp in June, there were over 4,000 sick men at Valley Forge. Now, medicine was still in its infancy by the time of the Revolution, but it had become somewhat professional. Philadelphia had the first medical school, and there were a number of doctors in the city who had trained at European institutions. However, there was no knowledge of bacteria, germs, or viruses. But that doesn't mean they didn't understand a couple things. They knew, for example, that cleanliness helped reduce infections. And they also knew that sick people needed to be separated from the well. Otherwise, well people would become sick. They didn't understand germs, but they knew disease spread. They also understood that some people who recover from a sickness will become immune to it, and that was important at Valley Forge. But they didn't really know about germs and exactly how best to help people who were infected. Now, the situation at Valley Forge was dire. Typhus, typhoid fever, dysentery, and pneumonia were rampant and common diseases. Amputation performed due to frostbite and often without any kind of anesthesia. There was a shortage of supplies and blankets and soap, food, and alcohol. There was also a shortage of cleanliness. Oftentimes, sick people would share blankets and also beds, and that meant they were sharing each other's diseases and lice, things like this. Sterilization was unknown at the time, so any kind of surgeries might often involve infection. But there was one big change that Washington instituted at Valley Forge. It was inoculation. He believed in inoculation at a time when most Americans did not. He had seen the benefits. What he had learned was that if one person gets just a little bit sick, they will often overcome a disease and never get it again. Now, this was important because smallpox had been raging throughout North America for centuries, and it did not spare the people in the army either. So he decided to inoculate the entire Continental Army, and this is how they did it. A patient who was recovering from smallpox would have little bubbles on their skin, and they would take a needle and a thread and run it through the bubble. When they pulled out the thread, it had smallpox on it. And then they would take a healthy man and make a small little cut on his arm and then run that needle and thread through the cut and give the man smallpox, but just a little bit. The man would come down with the disease, he would overcome it, and then he would be immune to smallpox for the rest of his life. By early February, everyone in the camp had been inoculated. Over 4,000 men protected from smallpox, saving the army. Of those 4,000 men, only 10 of them would perish from the disease. The other big change at Valley Forge was the role of women in helping this army survive the winter. Now, women had always been the caretakers of the sick, up until professional doctors who were required to be male. But these women came to Valley Forge with an enormous amount of knowledge about herbs and other family medicines, and sometimes they knew things that the doctors did not. Not only were they there to help raise the spirits of the men, to sing songs, to provide food, and even to help them write letters, but they were also medically so very necessary. Those women helped with all of these problems, and they also helped with cleaning, with surgeries, and with distribution of food and medicine. At Washington Hall, some of the local women from the surrounding neighborhoods would come in and raise the spirits of the men. And some of them were professional nurses receiving pay and rations for their work. In fact, when the nurses went without pay by May, they staged a little sit-in. They refused to work until they were paid. And Washington, he noticed the issue and he fixed it, making sure that those women were paid, who, after exercising their political voice, then returned to work, preparing bandages, medicines, cleaning beds and wounds. My main point in this lesson has been this: medicine was in its infancy, but the Continental Army left Valley Forge healthier than it had arrived.